Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to this sunny morning. So I hope everybody is well and is raring to go on matter 10, which is about employment land provision today. I'm not convinced I need to do major introductions. I think we've all been there, done that. But for anybody who is present in the room who hasn't been to one of these sessions before, my name is Yvonne Wright. I'm one of the inspectors who have been appointed to examine this plan, and Mr. Warden is also with me today. Mr. Warden, would you just like to say good morning?
Good morning, everybody.
Thank you. Again, I'm not going to do any more because Ms. Feeney has obviously provided you with details about camera, microphone, etc., and using the hands up facility, etc. So this morning's session is looking at our issue 11, particularly the first part of that issue 11, which is, does the plan set out a positively prepared strategy for the provision and delivery of employment land to meet identified needs within the borough that is justified and effective? And obviously, in relation to the second part of that, we're going to be looking at deliverability of the employment sites. So I just want to go through, I will be going through the trajectory, the employment trajectory. Now, we've already run through employment site allocations. That was done last week. I'm not proposing to go over anything that was discussed there. And I'm certainly not going to be going over anything in relation to employment needs, etc. Again, that was discussed under matter 5. Now, just before we do introductions, I would like to say, though, that the council has produced some further evidence in response to our requests coming out of matter 5. So, and this relates and includes F62, which is a briefing note on vacancy rates, and F27B, which is an update to F27, which provides a list of all employment sites lost from the beginning of the start of the plan period. So I will, once I've done introductions, I will, if anybody wishes to comment on those documents, I am willing to have a concise discussion about those documents if anybody has anything they wish to add. If not, then obviously we would just move on to the agenda as set through our MIQs on matter 11. So can I first of all ask everybody to introduce themselves, please, starting with the council.
Good morning, ma'am. My name is Paul Shaharibian, QC, and I'm acting for the council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector Tom Huang, Senior Policy Planner, Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you. I've got a Kieran Gunn-Jones for the council as well.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Inspectors. Kieran Gunn-Jones from Lichfields representing the council.
Lovely, thank you. And MM Properties, please.
Good morning, Inspectors. I'm Kieran Wheeler from Savills, and I'm joined by David Wasberg, who's going to lead on the discussions from our perspective.
Thank you. S&J Padfield and St Modwin, please.
Good morning, ma'am. My name is Reuben Taylor, QC, and I've got Mr. Sam Hollingworth from Stratton Parkers with me.
Thank you. Blackmore Village. Was that everybody from S&J Padfield? I do have a couple of other names down.
It is in terms of who's participating, I believe.
Okay. That's
but
fine.
If I'm wrong on that, somebody will shout.
That's fine. You can always bring them in. If there are other people, then just bring them in when obviously it's appropriate. Blackmore Village Heritage Association, please.
Good morning again, Mrs. Wright. It's Bill Ratcliffe, Chairman of Blackmore Village Heritage Association.
Thank you. Mr. Minot, please.
Yes, good morning, Inspector. This is Philip Minot.
Thank you. Representatives for Childerditch Industrial Estate, please.
Good morning, ma'am. Andy Butcher here from Stratton Parker on behalf of Childerditch Properties.
Thank you. And Countryside Properties, please.
Good morning, ma'am. Richard Clues, Stratton Parker, representing Countryside.
And thank you. West Horndon Parish Council, please.
Hello, Councillor Colin Fone, Vice Chairman of West Horndon Parish Council.
Thank you. Estates and Agency.
Good morning, Nick Ireland from Iceni Projects.
Great, thank you. Nobody else present who's not on my list. No, there's no hands up. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. I forgot to mention about we will be having a break mid-morning. We'll see how long this session goes and determine when that break occurs. Okay, that's the normal procedures. So does anybody have any comments that they wish to make on the additional evidence that the council produced following matter 5 at this stage? Mr. Ireland, please.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a few short comments on document F62, the employment vacancy rate note.
Yes.
The first of which is that I suppose as set out in paragraph 2.1, there's an acceptance. There appears to be an acceptance within this document that the in a normal functioning market, a vacancy level of around 8% might be expected to allow for, as it says there, the efficient operation of a normal market and to provide choice and competition and allow for the movement of firms such as through expansion and relocation. And the note sets out that the vacancy level is substantially below that. Now, I think if I stand back from the detail of this this document, the document looks at stock changes on the supply side, but what it doesn't include is an interrogation of trends in rents in the borough specifically, for commercial property in the borough specifically. So what we see at the back of the document in the appendix is an analysis of commercial property market trends, which includes some analysis of vacancy, of rental trends within that, but that's across Essex as a whole. And what we don't have is a specific interrogation here of the trends in rents specific to the borough. Now, why I think that's important is that the rental trend allows you to understand, in the context of, in the context which is being considered here, the balance between demand and supply. So growth in rents would essentially be indicative of an imbalance, insufficient supply relative to the demand position. I mean that as I see it is the fundamental thing that's really missing from this note, and therefore really I think taints the conclusions within it. Now I've looked at the latest CoStar data, which does provide rental data for the borough specifically. And that shows, looking at, say, the period from 2015 to 2020, a 6 year period, that industrial rents in the borough have increased from £6 per square foot in 2015, so £6 per square foot in 2015 to £9.50 at the end of 2020. So we should be interpreting a low a very low vacancy rate at the moment in those terms, alongside the rental trend. A similar picture emerges looking at offices, where the office rents over the similar timescale, £16.50 in 2015, £16.50 in 2015 to £21.30 at the end of 2020. Again, an increase in the rents in the rents for office space. And so I think that reinforces the point that we made at the Matter 5 the Matter 5 session, that really the margin that's been used, a 2-year margin that has been used in the in calculating the requirement for employment land, really isn't sufficient to provide essentially what might be expected in terms of a choice of sites and a level of available space within a functioning market. And because this note doesn't really address that point in terms of looking at the specifics of the borough, in terms of what the rents are showing about a supply-demand balance, I don't think it therefore really draws appropriate conclusions on that issue.
Thank you, Mr. Ireland. Mr. Wasberg, sorry, you're on your name tag.
Yes.
That comes up. It just says Dave, which is
not very helpful. Sorry.
Not very helpful. So I have to look. Yeah. So if you could possibly change that to Mr. Wasberg, that would be. Oh. There seems to be two. Who? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. I talked to the program officer.
I'm a bit confused now.
I talked to the program officer this morning and told her that my configuration is such that I watch through one device, but I listen.
Oh, that's okay. I was just making sure I had the correct person, so that's fine. Now, is this the point that you wish to make? Is it similar to Mr. Ireland's? Because I'm trying to decide whether, or is it a different point? Because I'd like a response from the council.
Yeah, it complements it. I won't go over Mr. Ireland's comments, although his reference to paragraph 2.1, I agree with, and we made this point in Matter 5 about the 8% vacancy that's required in order for property market to provide suitable alternatives for potential occupiers. I found that the note was helpful in identifying the reason for the low vacancy, which is an insufficient level of delivery historically, and also significant loss of existing employment premises. It doesn't have a sense of urgency about this. I mean, this is an acute under provision. And just one more point. I mean, we calculated the amount of land that would be necessary in order for the council to provide premises to enable it to achieve an 8% vacancy rate, and that was 2.2 hectares. So this is an additional 2.2 hectares that the council needs to provide in order to address this. Unfortunately, the council's employment land need is entirely focused on future need and not addressing this immediate shortage. Thank you.
And I know that and that was raised as part of Matter 5, so I'm not going to go over Matter 5 again. But what do you have any you've referred to the briefing note that's been provided. Is there anything further you want to add or any comments you want to make to the specifics of the new evidence that's been provided by the council to add to your representations?
No further comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Wasberg. Can I come to the council for a response on the points that have been raised then, please?
Mum, I'm going to ask Mr. Gunn-Jones to respond to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mum. I mean, in terms of the observations about F62, I think it's important to point out, as we highlight in the note at para 2.1, that there are a range of factors at play that both influence vacancy levels over time and indeed rental levels over time as well. And without wishing to repeat our discussion at matter 5, we've heard from participants a range of different figures produced based on different vacancy rates and adjustments to that, and our participants refer to different figures that would be required to get to this theoretical 8% that is referred to in terms of a normal market vacancy rate. I think it's important to say that that normal market vacancy rate, the one that's referred to in the GLA guidance, which we refer to in F62, is an advisory note, and it's not actually necessarily applicable in this particular location. Brentwood isn't in London. But I think what I want to do is also repeat what we briefly talked about at matter 5, which is the council has taken the top end of the baseline requirement of the scenarios that were considered through the Economic Futures study. On top of that baseline requirement, it has added an additional provision to replace sites that will be lost during the course of the planned period through reallocation. And perhaps most importantly, has also provided an allowance of about 9 hectares, which is to re-provide for losses that have been reflected in the very latest monitoring data. And we may come on to say more about that later in this session. That latter point is important because, as our note F62 illustrates, it's the comparatively high rate of losses of space in Brentwood that have been a key part of driving down, if you like, the level of vacancy, because there's been a relatively modest level of completions. And so what's happened is the net result over time, taking on board all of those losses, is that the overall stock, certainly for both offices and industrial, hasn't changed very much over time. It is important to say, however, I think that there has been a modest increase in the industrial stock in Brentwood over time. And in terms of the position, Brentwood sits somewhere between its comparator or neighbouring Essex authorities, which I think is why the Essex data is relevant to the discussion, because essentially the Brentwood has lost less than some locations and has lost more than others. And essentially the market dynamic that applies in Brentwood very much is consistent with that position overall. So all I would reiterate, I think, to pick up both of the comments that have been made this morning, is that the context provided in F62 shows that essentially that vacancy position has been factored in to some degree. In the end, the approach that the council has adopted is consistent with the PPG as discussed at the Matter 5 session. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to move on from discussing F62. Obviously, I've heard what different participants have had to say on that issue. Does anybody have any comments to make on F27B or anything that the council wishes to add? It was a direct request from ourselves for additional evidence, so we thank the council for providing that. But if anybody wishes to comment on it, they may do so. It's quite a chunky document. It's not a short one.
Nothing from us, Ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Right, I've got no hands up. Okay. Thank you for that. Can we now move on to the elements relating to our MIQ for employment land provision now, please? Now, as discussed as part of Matter 5, the Council states that employment needs range between 38.41 hectares and 50.61 hectares. And the updated employment land provision is 46.64 hectares. Now, and the council considers that the supply will provide flexibility to meet employment needs over the lifetime of the plan. And in that context, policy PCO2, which sets out that figure, that employment land provision figure, you propose to update that because obviously the figures have slightly changed. Now, before we look at the wording of policy PCO2 in a bit more detail, and I know we have looked at PCO2, we looked at that as part of Matter 5, but we now need to just look at it in terms of the supply as well, and the proposed or the suggested changes that are set out by the council. So it's just understanding what needs to be changed and what doesn't from what the policy says in the submitted plan. I'm trying to understand the element of the need for flexibility when we're dealing with greenbelt land and the balance that needs to be made there. I know some participants around the table are requesting more land should be provided for employment purposes, and obviously we heard that in Matter 5, and not proposing to open that discussion up again. We will obviously consider those representations that have been made to us, but I want to understand from the sort of the council's perspective about the need for this flexibility and how that can come into play in demonstrating exceptional circumstances. Now, having said that, I wanted to say that, but obviously the council is at the moment responding to a letter that we sent about demonstrating exceptional circumstances for site allocations. So I'm not proposing that the council needs to respond to that now, but I just wanted to make it clear that that letter also applies obviously to all development sites. And so if the council can just take that on board when coming back with their response to our recent letter on demonstrating exceptional circumstances, that'd be very useful. So again, I'm not proposing to necessarily open up the debate now, because it could be that we're perfectly content with what the council says. It could be that we do decide additional land is needed. We could go down the route and decide that actually the identified need is a range. Why not go for the lower end of the range? So that's something we have made no decisions on that at all at the moment. That's something that myself and my colleague will be considering as we move forward through and go through all of the other hearing sessions. I suppose in terms of the supply, what I'd just like to understand is if we were minded to either reduce or increase the requirement, what implications would that have for the council? And again, it's very theoretical at this stage, but I just want to understand if we were minded to either reduce the number and take it down to the lower end of the range, or if we were minded to actually, we think that the need should be higher, etc. We've identified a higher need, therefore the requirement needs to be higher. What implications, if any, would that have for the council in terms of its overall strategy and bringing forward this plan?
I'm happy to take that question, if that's okay. So the council would the council aimed to plan and take a robust approach, ma'am, in terms of providing for future employment needs. And the NPPF is clear that plan should create the conditions in which jobs would be created, and it should also, at the minimum, meet the at least meet the minimum objectively assessed needs. So in doing so, the council has commissioned Litchfield to forecast model the 4 different scenarios in which we based our land provision on. Now, in terms of elements of flexibility that you are and the implications that you are inquiry, I think the implication or the risk that we may face in planning for the lower ends is that the loss of employment land from permitted development rights. And I think we have set out in matter 5 in our hearing statement, especially this is demonstrated through the monitoring data in the past 4 years. The amount of planning applications come forward through permitted development rights as increasing exceedingly, and also with the changes in the government's latest with regards to permitted development rights, we are concerned that it may have some implications further in the future. So that is one element to consider, and the other is that we are currently in an area in a period of considerable uncertainty, and it is exacerbated by the pandemic. And for example, if we look at office developments, at the moment, on one hand, there is increasing trends in working from home, but at the same time, that does not necessarily mean that in the future office needs or office space requirements would decrease, because we are now looking at firms that are that in the past was running on 10 square meter per person. Then now they're looking at 20 to 30 square meters per person. So we are at the period where it is very uncertain. So and that justify our approach in set out the needs as a range rather than a specific number. And going forward, the role of monitoring employment net gains or loss would play a part in deciding or making decisions on how much employment land provision on certain planning applications, and whether that meets the needs, and or whether that's suitable or appropriate in the local context. So I think in terms of let's see, the needs range that we set out, 33 to 76 to 45.96. When we take into account the 9.3 hectares from permitted land loss, that has increased, as you set out, to 50.61. When we look at that, the new needs range from 30.8.41 to 56.1, we still consider that the 46.64 hectares, I'm sorry, there's a lot of number, but let's say
it's very precise number.
I understand, but anyway, the supply of land that we have there, you see, when we consider it against the 4 scenarios, if you look at different scenarios, A, B, C, D, then you would see that that supply would still result in a surplus in the 3 scenarios, and it may not need we may be meeting a little bit short on the scenario A, the top range. However, let's say if those 4 scenarios is the only 4 possibility that that is laid out in the council, then we have more chances of meeting our needs than not. So I think in summary, that supply that we set out in PC02 is still a robust approach, and it is a sound requirement.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't want to go back over the scenarios and that. We did all that as part of Matter 5 and understanding the identified need. I understand all the scenarios. It was what the implications would be for the council if we were to come to a conclusion, and it's very much an if. I'm just setting it out there as because people have requested a higher number. The range, there is a range for the need, so we're trying to understand why you've gone for the higher number and how that impacts on the Greenbelt. That's our particular concern. So it's that implication. So I fully understand where the council is coming from in terms of wanting to provide flexibility, and you've set out your concerns in relation to the issues in relation to the where we are at the moment in terms of the world. You can't control those factors at all. But I just want to understand that if we were to come back with either requesting the council to provide a higher land supply, what would be the implications for the council? And then if we were to come back and reduce the number, what would be the implications for the council? Just so that I just have a general understanding.
Perhaps
as to, yeah. Mr. Shadaravian, please.
Yeah. If one has regard to paragraph 81 of the MPPF, particularly subparagraph D, which exhorts local authorities to be flexible enough to accommodate needs not anticipated in the plan, allow for new and flexible working practices, and to enable a rapid response to changes in economic circumstances. Judged against that requirement, the approach we're taking is absolutely justified. But putting that to one side, should you decide, nonetheless, that there is too much flexibility and therefore the potential surpluses are such that it doesn't justify the releases we are anticipating ought to be made, then of course it would mean identifying which sites should be either reduced in size or dismissed.
And how would that impact on your growth strategy?
Well, this is
growth.
This is something which we would need to consider, because it's not just a question of floor space. It's a question of where it is, having regard to where population growth is going to occur. So there are a number of dynamics there which would need to be considered. So that's the position there. And it would rather depend upon the extent to which the requirement should be reduced. And of course, those are unknown matters at the moment. So the task may be made difficult or it may be made simpler, depending upon the amount by which the surplus is to be reduced, assuming you find there is surplus after hearing all the evidence. The consequences of having to find more land is that we would need, in the same way as housing provision, we would need to go out and undertake another call for sites in order to identify where that provision might be best located, having regard to availability, deliverability, and other factors. So again, it's an unknown. It's a process with an unknown outcome at the moment. But we couldn't simply say, well, these qualifying sites, which we haven't actually included in the plan, ought to come in. We have to open up the process again to proper and due consideration, as you well understand.
Yeah, we understand the process, yes.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Mr. Wasberg.
Yes, hi, I just wanted to make a couple of quick points. One, there's reference to a potential surplus, and I just want to point out that now, based on the council's information, scenario A results in a deficit of 4 hectares. This is factual. This is completely based on the council's information. And also, I just wanted to express a little bit of concern about this idea. The council initially expressed that scenario A was by far the best, the preferred, and this was also recommended in the council's employment land review. But in the council's Matter 5 statement, sorry, I don't want to go over this too much, but it refers to scenarios B, C, and D as having potentially negative implications. And these include not providing sufficient employment opportunities for the local labor supply, not allocating sufficient land to retain and meet future demand for businesses within the borough boundary, and not re-providing for the continued loss of employment floor space through permitted development. I'm concerned about the council's inconsistency with regard to this. Scenario A is the essential scenario, and they've sort of switched in their recent statement to saying, well, their provision meets the needs range, meaning scenarios A through D. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got several hands up. I'm going to bring in Mr. Taylor, please.
Madam, thank you. You will have seen from the Matter 5 statement that we've provided to you a report by Volterra, which looks at the council's appraisal of employment needs. And Volterra have accepted that the council's adopted appropriate methodology and assumptions, and that its conclusions are accepted. That work, alongside our Matter 5 statement, establishes that even if you adopt the very bottom end of the employment needs range, the need range is still such that it can only be met if the Brentwood Enterprise Park Site E11 comes forward. So whatever conclusion you come to in that regard, the Brentwood Enterprise Park E11 site is essential going forward for a sound plan to be able to meet employment needs. In terms of the issue of flexibility, I think it is right to see that in the context of exceptional circumstances, by reminding oneself of what the court has said in the Compton case, that there's a broad discretion in taking into account factors when looking at exceptional circumstances. The requirement for flexibility in the NPPF, of course, is flexibility in relation to needs that aren't anticipated. And that's important to remember. But in addition, I would make this point, which is that flexibility is more important the more uncertain the times are that one's facing. At present, we are in uncertain times with the pandemic, but also with the implications of Brexit for reshoring requirements and the like. So that suggests that there is a greater need for flexibility than there might be in normal times when the economy is roaring, for example. And so in a Greenbelt authority such as this, it is important to set the Greenbelt boundary on a basis that allows for flexibility in sites coming forward, because if you don't, you will constrain the ability of the local authority and the local employment market to meet needs for a potentially significant period of time, because it takes time to amend Greenbelt boundaries, and of course when they are amended it's meant to be permanent and to go beyond the planned period. And so on behalf of my clients, I would ask you to bear that in mind, and I'm no doubt that you will going forward. In terms of where, if additional employment land is required, then clearly work would have to be done. But there are there are sites available already that we know about. Codham Hall Farm, for example, has made representations to you explaining that it is a location which has already been developed. There's existing employment there. It's within the growth corridor, close to the strategic road network, and it provides precisely the type of employment that Volterra has identified is required, namely land that meets SME requirements. So there are easy choices to make going forward. And again, we would ask you to bear that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Obviously, we're not going to be discussing emission sites at all. So obviously, you got that one in there, but I'm not taking any notice of that, I'm afraid. Right. That's something that obviously would come into the fray if we were minded to increase the requirement, etc.
Indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor, for your comments there. Ms. Huang, anything further you wish to add in response from the council side? Because I then just want to then start to have a look at the actual policy wording. So.
Yeah, I just want to address what Mr. Westenberg has raised, and I just want to reinstate that the council has not been inconsistent in our approach. We still aim for the upper range, and I have a look in your table 2.1 from MM Properties, and again, you will see that across these four scenarios, three of the scenarios is still on the plus side. Only scenario A is on the potentially short of 3.2 hectares. But again, this scenario is based on the needs range from 38.41 to 50.61, and I want to perhaps make a note that this needs range that we set out in matter 5 should be exercised with caution, because there is a little bit of overlapping time frame there, which is why, I mean, in matter 5, I didn't want to go way too much into details, because, you know, in the thought, I was just worried that maybe it will dilute the conversation. However, I would like to point out that these four scenarios were based on the 20 years period from 2013 to 2033, and the 9.3 hectares that make up the needs range that potentially goes up to 50.61. That 9.3 hectares there in the third line of your statement, Mr. Westenberg, the time frame of that is potentially from the past period up until 2020. So there is a 7 years of all of that overlapping time frame. Now in forecasting, there is always, you know, an element of data imperfections. But
it's not an exact science, I understand that.
Yeah, so 7 years overlapping there that we use for this time frame, it should be exercised with cautions. Therefore, I would say the council is still consistent with its approach, meeting its upper needs range, and we will take that flexible approach going forward.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Ms. Huang. I want to now just move on and look at the suggested look at policy PCO2, and I know suggested changes were proposed in F9A, and further suggested changes have been set out in the council's hearing statement. Now, there are some necessary changes that do need to be made to update the figures or the land figure there. And I know that some other changes are being made in relation to PCO7 and bringing that in terms of retail, but that's obviously a retail matter that we're going to be discussing this afternoon, so I'm not going to go into that. And obviously there are also changes in relation to the revised or the use class order. So those are all absolutely necessary, because that then provides clarity on that point. So does anybody wish to comment on those proposed changes? So it's mainly in relation to the figures and updating in relation to the UCO? No. can the council just explain so that I can understand in more detail why the additions are necessary to the supporting text in relation to training, education and skills, and why that needs to be, because this is the supporting text PCO2. So I'm trying to understand, no reference is made in PCO2 because this is your overarching policy where you're setting out your requirement, your land supply, etc. So why is it necessary to put in this additional wording for soundness? Ms. Huang, please.
Yes, ma'am. So this has been discussed with Essex County Council and agreed in our statement of common ground. And this approach has been set out in Essex County Council Developers Guide to Infrastructure Contributions, and it's based on a need of the wider area in terms of employment skills provision. So we agreed that the supporting text would add some clarity and hook for when we consider the Essex County's developer's guide.
That doesn't really answer my question as to why it's necessary for soundness, because if it's already in a guide that is used by the council and that's made clear within the plan that that must be considered, then obviously that's part of the consideration in dealing with any planning application that comes forward. If it's a requirement, it needs to be set out in policy.
I see.
But I'm trying to just understand why it's necessary for this to be set out in. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing or anything, but I'm trying to understand from a policy perspective.
Ma'am, it was a response to Essex County Council. It's a matter for you to decide whether or not it's needed for soundness. I expect that on balance it probably isn't. There's nothing in there we'd want to include in the policy.
Thank you. I've got a couple of hands up. I presume in relation to this particular point. So I'm going to come to Mr. Wasserberg, please.
Yes, hi. I mean, I just had some corrections that I wanted to alert you to with regard to the wording, but not this particular point.
That's fine if you want to bring that in now.
Okay. I mean, I think this is possibly agreed, but I just wanted to alert you to on page 4 of G10A, the table at the bottom, which is
Bear with me because I need to get that up. Which part?
So the bottom table?
The bottom table on which page?
Page 4.
Okay, yeah. We haven't quite got there, but that's fine. You can tell me your concerns now.
Well, the council already agreed that in the third row, the 4.65 hectares should be 9.3.
Council. Sorry, anything further?
Yeah, then obviously the combined requirement down below would be changed.
Oh, it's turning into anarchy, isn't it now? Right. Anything further, Mr. Wasserberg? So you're saying that there's an error in terms of the numbers on that table?
Yeah, I mean, it's already agreed by the council, so I mean, it shouldn't be controversial. It's just an oversight.
It's just highlighting it. Okay. Sorry, Ms. Huang, did you want to?
There is one more.
Yep.
And that refers to the forward offices. Eagle Way, Worley. So that's
which table are we looking at now?
Well, that would be well, it would be the table that ends on page 6.
Right, we haven't got to that policy yet. So can I just leave that one for now, and we will come back to that because that's as
Fine.
part of PCO3. So if we can just stick with PCO2 and the supporting text for that at the moment. So
Sure.
Can I just have a council doesn't have to respond on this. Can the council just double check their figures to make sure that there is consistency?
We will.
Across that point. Okay, thank you. Miss, oh, okay, that's gone. Mr. Ratcliffe, please, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Wright. I've just heard what you said about, is this a policy or a nice to have under PCO2 job growth and employment land, but just a lot of research that my firm did within the last 2 or 3 years. Training and education is one of the key drivers of the South Essex economy, given the extent of the colleges and universities that already exist. So if it's a nice to have, I fully endorse what Ms. Huang said. If it's not within policy, then that's your decision. But I just thought I'd add from a local flavour, the wording is very noble.
Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe. If the council can just have a look, well, I've got the wording there, whether we accept that as a suggested change. The purpose of the supporting text is to justify what's set out in the policy. So the policy doesn't refer to that. So whether a policy should refer to that, that's something that we will consider. So thank you. Mr. Ratcliffe, your hand is still up. Is there another point you wanted to make?
No, sorry, that's my normal IT skill delinquency.
That's fine. Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. Can we now have a look at PCO3 then, please? For this one, can the council, because we had discussed PCO2 previously under matter 5, could the council just explain the purpose of this policy as set out in the submitted plan, please? So just so that it's clear, just give a summary of what this policy is trying to achieve, please.
Sorry, ma'am. The purpose of the policy is very simple. It's trying to safeguard employment land for intended uses on the site allocations.
So it's the existing employment sites
and the new yes.
new employment sites, so it's both. You've set that out in your hearing statement, so obviously I've read that. In that case, in relation to, I've got a couple of questions then. Is that an appropriate approach, that it should apply to both new allocations and existing sites? But also then, is there consistency between the wording of PCO3 and the site allocation policies relating to employment? Because I know that has been raised by several participants as an issue or a potential issue.
It's a potential issue, but I don't think it's a real issue. So I'm getting feedback from someone's. I don't know if someone's left their mic on. It's gone. It's gone. But the point of this is that the the gravamen, if you like, of PCO3 is that there is protection afforded to existing and future and new employment land allocations in the way set out in the policy to restrict any changes of use which may dilute the employment offered within the borough. That's simply it. So it's appropriate, therefore, to identify existing and new employment land allocations.
How is this to, and I've raised this issue before, so please, if the council could just go through this again. I'm trying to understand how this would apply, because this is trying to protect existing, I'm thinking about existing employment sites at the moment. It's trying to protect these sites from moving away from alternative uses, so ensuring that alternative uses aren't brought on board. But how does that fit with existing sites that already have planning permission, and where the UCO now kicks in and changes within a class? I'm thinking particularly of Class E, now doesn't restrict movement to other Class E uses because it's not development. It's not deemed development, therefore doesn't require planning permission. So how does that apply? I fully understand, I fully agree that a policy needs to be set out so that existing employment allocations don't change to other uses, other use class orders, because then that would need planning permission. You can make that clear within the policy. But how does it relate? How can you ensure that an existing site doesn't change from office use to retail because it's now within the same use class? So
yeah,
how?
It's dealing with the ferret in the chicken coop, isn't it?
Yes.
Put it mildly. The problem that is a real problem in relation to office use, clearly, and it's something which is perhaps preventable in relation to new employment land allocations and in relation to any future redevelopment of existing employment sites where the proposal is for an office type development coming within Class E, which might be constrained by the use of a Section 106 obligation to prevent further changes to other uses within use Class E. It becomes more problematic, of course, in relation to office use on existing sites, and so the effectiveness of the policy will be diluted to that extent in relation to office uses, current sites currently in office use.
Does that then affect in any way how the policy is written, or do you consider that you just need to have the policy as is and then deal with factors that are outside the control of the policy and outside the UCO as it now stands is as it is, isn't it? So
it is as it is, and so we're just going to have to exercise as much control as we can, having regard to the liberty which new use classes offer existing employment sites which are in office use.
Thank you. Does anybody want to come in on that particular point or issue? Okay, I've got two hands up. They both went up at a very similar time, so I'm going to go to Mr. Minot first, and then I'll come to Mr. Taylor.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. In terms of the specific point, it may not be precisely the specific point you were just talking about, but in terms of the issue in relation to PCO3 and whether there's consistency between PCO3 and the site allocation policies, I think it's worth just highlighting again the way in which you have site allocation policies and the two specific examples actually are neither of them employment site allocation policies. R15 and R12, the residential site allocation policies, Obviously, as I was talking before last week, R15, you've got an existing employment site, which was the designation of that was changed so that it would become a residential or residential stroke retail. R12 is an existing employment site that for some reason the council never saw fit to regard as an employment site, although it wasn't a fly-by-night situation. It had been an employment site for a long while. In neither of those cases has the council, or did the council see fit to do anything at all to protect the employment use of those sites, to do the things which are being claimed in various places. PCO3, it's saying this, the G10A submission, which the council has put in, again is trying to underline that in areas allocated for general employment and office development on the policies map, the presumption is that employment uses and sui generis uses of any employment nature will be retained. Proposals entailing loss of employment premises and sites without replacement will be resisted. If we set aside the without replacement side of that for a moment, the council in itself and in its own policies, in its own site policies, going against the direction, its own claimed direction of movement in terms of protecting employment sites. And the thing which is characteristic between the two sites that I've specifically mentioned there, I mean, you've got other examples. You've got the Ford site, you've got the West Taunton Industrial Estate site. The two ones that I've specifically mentioned, both Brentwood Town Centre sites, and we have this issue whether it's appropriate to go into it more extensively right at this instant or maybe later on. There's this issue as to whether the usefulness of having employment sites which are appropriate within a town centre location, within semi-residential, general centre, close to good transport routes, close to amenities, whether that's a valuable thing to have. I understand that it's generally regarded as being valuable, but it does seem that the council, although it's saying one thing in policies like PCO3 and in things like G10A, its actual site allocation policies are doing something pretty much diametrically opposite. And you can point at the specific examples that I've pointed at. And the question that in my mind is raised by that is the question of where it is in any of the documents that the council is justifying effectively undermining town centre employment sites. The council is using policies like PCO03 to try and ensure that there isn't further erosion of certain sites, but we've seen the figures in terms of the way in which permitted development rights have massively eroded the amount of employment square meterage in the borough. That's something, I mean, it happens in various different places, but it's something which is absolutely happening very much in town centres, in residential centres. It's something that the council, I believe, is not in favour of, since we have policies, more general policies like PCO3, which seem to be setting out a way of trying to stop this erosion. But at the same time, the council is actually not just allowing erosion, but as it were, digging away the bank in terms of specific site allocation policies. And I find it extremely difficult to understand the pretty much, well, to my mind, direct contradiction between those two things. If it was easy to demonstrate that the council was doing what it claims it's going to be doing in terms of protecting employment sites, retaining employment sites, resisting proposals which entail the loss of employment premises, there wouldn't be any issue here. But you can't do that because the council itself is proposing to lose sites which are employment premises, not to retain them and not to resist when, I think in the case of both R12 and R15, you've got landowners, developers coming forward and saying, actually, we'd really like to do this and it doesn't involve this site being an employment site. And the council's essentially rolling over and saying, oh, yeah, that's fine. And I haven't seen any planning argument as to why that's justifiable, and particularly when you look at the fact that the council is simultaneously prepared to take on board sites which were, sorry, my throat's going dry, sites which were in the real world had become employment sites, but were in the green belt, sites like E10 and E12, and to say, okay, they may be greenbelt sites, they've become employment sites, we're perfectly prepared to make them employment sites in the new plan. You contrast that with a site like R12, where it's a brownfield site, it's in the town centre, it's perfectly appropriate employment site for the town centre, perfectly appropriate uses in the town centre, but it is said, right, we're ignoring the fact that that's an employment site, we're simply going to designate it for residential use. That seems like a very odd contradiction and a very odd route through the process of assessing sites, working out which sites you should be allocating for which purposes in which order. And I don't think it stacks up. I think there's serious contradictions.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. Can I bring in, I'll bring in Mr. Taylor, please, and then Mr. Clues.
Madam, thank you. It's just a very short point, taking us back to the implications of the use classes order and the ability to switch between an employment use under Class E and non-employment uses. And it's just really to remind you that, of course, in the context of Compton and the broad range of factors that one can take into account when looking at whether exceptional circumstances exist, and indeed in the context of the need for flexibility in plans to meet employment needs, the potential loss of employment land from existing employment use via the operation of the use classes order is plainly a factor to take into account when making the planning judgment that's required. And on behalf of my clients, I would make the point that the potential loss of land from existing employment sites simply supports the adoption of the top end of the employment range that the council's identified, and indeed may justify the adoption of a figure beyond the top of that range to take into account the potential loss and to provide the sort of flexibility that the NPPF looks for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Clues, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. Your question, I think, mostly related to Class E, but you also asked a question about the consistency of policies with allocations. Is that something I can cover now?
Yes, that's absolutely fine.
Thank you. Our request as a modification is actually relatively straightforward. Back on matter 7D for Shenfield, it was agreed with the council that the allocation R03, the wording for that policy should be amended to allow around 2 hectares of employment use, and that perhaps a reduced quantum would be acceptable, and there's specific reasons for that regarding that allocation, which I can go through again if necessary.
No, please don't. Thank you.
No.
Not necessary. Thank you.
Our concern with and as you say, the consistency with the proposed modifications to PC3 is that under R03, and in fact for all the sites, they are very precise figures. And when a decision maker came to judging which policy to apply, there's no indication of whether R03 should apply or whether PC03 should apply, and they would be essentially potentially inconsistent in having a very strict 2 hectares written now into the policy under PC03, whereas it says around 2 hectares under R03. I think that's relatively easily rectified. The table in column 3 could simply say around 2 hectares rather than being a precise 2.0. That might not work on Excel in the summary at the bottom, but I'm sure it can be done in words. Or it probably more effectively, it could say that preference will be taken for policy R03, and that this table and this policy is more informative in regards to the employment components.
Thank you, Mr. Clues. Well, actually that brings us on to the point that I was going to raise next, was that previously these sites were in a figure 7.6, and in response to one of our MIQs, the council has said that, because obviously if you're allocating these sites, they need to be in a policy. It doesn't mean that that all of the information needs to be in the policy. It's just the allocations need to be in the policy. So you don't have to specify that this is X number of, hectares of land, etc. Because what's important is the actual allocation itself. So council response on the point that Mr. Clues has made. Any points that you want to respond to with Mr. Minot and Mr. Taylor as well, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. It's true, we don't need to set out the areas adjacent to each of the identified allocations existing and proposed. This is not an allocating policy in any event, so we don't need to do that. That's the first thing. Second thing is the point you raised earlier, I've reflected on again. You will note, Ma'am, that we have suggested modifications to the policy. That's in our response. Quite clearly, we say that the amendments we're proposing here, the modifications we're proposing, actually bring greater certainty to the way in which the provisions work. And so it makes the policy much more effective. And of course, we've also changed the reference to the business uses. In relation to a potential change of use from offices, we are there dealing with the use classes order, which governs changes of use, not redevelopment, as you well know. So the policy would be effective if a proposal came forward for a redevelopment of an office site. It would not be effective from the point of view of a change of use of offices to another e-use. So the question is, how will the policy be interpreted? And of course, and the policy has to be compliant with the law and with the planning regime as it is. It does refer to redevelopment or change of use from offices. We could amend that first paragraph slightly to make redevelopment and change of use applicable to R&D, B2 and B8. Sorry, I should have included light industrial as well as offices in that analysis. And refer to redevelopment from offices or light industrial, just to make that distinction. So then the policy would be consistent with the use classes order.
And the point that's been raised by Mr. Clues in relation to the consistency with the allocation policies.
So just bear with me, I'm getting... Sorry, what'd you say?
So that table, we can just add indicative developable area. So.
Sorry, I was just taking some advice from Ms. Hine.
So are you just proposing to just take out all these numbers then?
Yes,
so
just take them out. Just take them out because the allocation deals with it as around, which is the appropriate way to do it.
Okay, right. Okay. Any further comments? So, Council, are you going to come back on policy PC03 then to provide an updated, suggested version that takes on board the UCO issues and obviously this consistency with the allocation? Yes. Mr. Wasserberg, please.
Yes. Is this an appropriate time to raise an issue about one of the sites in PC03?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay. The Ford offices, Eagle Way, Worley. So that is part of R04.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this site represents a significant loss of employment floor space, but that's not the point that I want to make here. It's this idea that this site will be able to provide or reprovide 2 hectares of employment land. So this site is a Ford office. It's a huge complex. It's being converted to 330 odd flats.
We sorry, Mr. Wasserberg, we did discuss this site in great detail last week. So we are aware that the employment element of the site would be on the council-owned part of the allocation, which includes the existing council depot that's on there. So if you can just, so I'm more than happy to.
The depot is on another site, I believe. It's north of the north of Eagle Way.
So it's on RO5. So this should say RO5 then. Is that what you're saying? Because the policy refers to RO4 and RO5 in terms of the site allocation policy. I've no idea why it's called 2 different numbers. I still don't get my head around that. But anyway, it should just be one policy number.
If I can assist, Mark,
anyway.
you're absolutely right, of course. And in the left-hand part of this table, next to that Ford offices reference, it should be part of RO5.
It should be, yes.
Yeah.
Does that help, Mr. Wasserberg? Because you're absolutely right. It's not proposed as was discussed last week in the site allocation sessions. It's not proposed that there would be employment on RO4. So does that help your query?
So that's an error that you're saying.
Yes.
And so the council is not.
But those figures don't have to be. Those numbers don't have to be in there anyway, because as long as the sites are identified, that's all that matters in relation to allocations.
So you're saying that the 2 hectares will be delivered elsewhere?
On RO5, which is the same policy. RO4 and RO5 are the same policy. So it's the same allocation.
I find that very confusing. I don't see RO5 referred to in this at all.
No, it's not referred to in here, but it is in the site allocation. This is why it's important that PCO3 is very clear and is consistent with the site allocation policies, which is obviously what we're discussing. And obviously, Mr. Wasserberg, that's caused you some confusion and may cause others some confusion. So the council is now proposing to remove it. At the moment, the policy doesn't include the allocations at all, whether it's existing or whether it's the new. Now, in order to be, now there is an argument as to why that policy needs to add the allocations in there, because they're already going to be allocated or suggested to be allocated through the plan through individual site allocations. The purpose of this policy is more to set out the existing employment sites, and then so that it's very clear as to what the council considers an employment site to be, plus the allocations, because obviously they will become existing employment sites should they come forward for development, etc. And then set out proposals to try and protect and retain those employment sites. So it's simply by adding those sites in, it simply just needs that error just needs to be changed. It's a very simple.
Okay, I mean, and I'm willing to wait and see how this is this policy is made clear. However, the council chooses to do so. My concern still remains, and the fact that whether it's RO4 or RO5, that these sites will deliver 2 hectares of employment, because I don't believe that to be the case. I don't believe it.
But again, that was, Mr. Wasserberg, that was discussed at a site allocation policy session last week. So I'm not proposing, and it was explained to us because we were concerned about that, and it was explained to us in the session. So I'm not. I would. It may be worth you having a chat with the council outside of this session, just to allay your to run through to just run through that with them, because obviously you weren't present in the actual hearing session dealing with that site allocation, but it was explained to us, and in quite a bit of detail as to how the proposal is supposed to come forward. So
okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wasberg. Okay, no other questions at the moment. So can I just understand then that this, and again, it was raised as part of yesterday's session, this issue about whether sites have been, whether these are existing employment sites, are they already on the existing policies map? I.e. the proposals map as it's called, even though proposals map doesn't exist anymore, but that's what they were called. So if the council could just clarify that.
We're just checking that. We're just checking that.
Thank you.
I don't think they all are. What we'll do, rather than answer you without knowing exactly what the situation is, we'll identify them on a short note for you. So I don't think all of them are.
Because I suppose what I'm trying to understand is if they're new sites coming forward for allocation, although they're existing, so they're committed sites, if this is the first time that they're going to be allocated within the plan and that policies will relate to them. Yeah. Because the other way of dealing with it is not to list them and just say all existing employment sites, but then that doesn't always provide clarity. So it's just that issue in terms of a policy change to your existing proposals map, and whether it is a change that's been highlighted to your policy.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll check that out, most certainly.
If you can, that'd be very useful. Thank you.
And actually, you raised something which is something I've been thinking about too, is whether or not you do need to list all these sites, or whether you have a policy which refers to existing and allocated sites. So you don't need then to worry about the proposals map in that sense.
Yes, it's then whether the council is clear then as to when this policy would apply to existing sites.
Yes, and that will be a matter of fact, of course. Rather than overload the policy with these modifications, apart from those which are required to make it effective, there may be a case actually for not referring to the sites at all. So I will give that some thought, if I may.
If you could give that some thought, because obviously, and we will give that some thought as well.
And so what I will do is draft some alternative modifications to the policy, which you may consider.
I'd be content with that, because I think then myself and my colleague need to consider what is the best approach in terms of soundness to ensure that it's very clear and provides absolute certainty as to when PCO3 will apply.
Very good.
Okay, so thank you for that. And if you can just clarify whether any existing employment sites are in the Greenbelt or not, that would be really useful as well.
Indeed, absolutely.
Because if they are, then it's how, and if they're not inset, they are actually washed over by the Greenbelt, then how would a policy apply to those sites if they do exist?
Indeed, absolutely.
And can I just clarify, and you may have said this before in a previous session, can you just clarify that the plan clearly sets out that these site allocations are being removed from the Greenbelt when I'm talking about the new allocations?
So, Ma'am, do forgive me. I was in a quick conversation.
That's okay.
In relation to our previous.
Can you just that's fine. Can you just clarify whether the plan clearly sets out that the proposed site allocations are to be removed from the Greenbelt?
Yes, indeed.
It does clearly set that out, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Does anybody have any comments they wish to make about the criteria that are listed in PCO3 at all? I know we've discussed the UCO issues, etc. But is there anything else in relation to policy PCO3? No, because I'm just going to turn to policy E12. Now, I know this isn't in this session, and we have had a session on policy E12, but the council has put in an amendment to policy E12 in its hearing statement on this particular point. So it's in its G10A. And I know obviously we have representatives for Childerditch in the room, Mr. Butcher. Is there any comments you wish to make on the hearing statement proposals? I think the council's just updating the number, the amount of land. Is my understanding correct on this E12?
Yes, ma'am. If I can come in there, that is correct. And Euless, I'd refer you again to our statement of common ground, where we resolve this issue, so that hopefully there is now some clarity against the site areas. And what is now in PCO3 reflects what we have agreed with the council to take into account a bit of work, measured site survey, an assessment of what is in the existing development plan in terms of the allocation and the new areas. So those matters are covered, as I say, within the statement of common ground.
Great. Thank you for that clarity, because that certainly helps. What I'd like to do, because we're coming up to 11 o'clock now, I'd like to take a break. When we come back, I'd like to look at specifically deliverability. So I'll be going through the employment trajectory as set out in the hearing statement, because obviously that has now updated the previous trajectory that was provided to us. So thank you to the council for updating that. I want to go through that, and then there are just a couple of other policies that we need to go through. So it shouldn't be a too lengthy session, because some of the other policy elements that I want to discuss are quite short. So if I can suggest that we have a 20-minute break and come back at, it's just gone 5 to, well, can we come back at 20 past 11, please? And then we'll continue on deliverability. So thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back after the break. Now, I said just before the break we'd move on to deliverability, but I have been informed just during the break that Mr. Wasserberg, you wanted to provide some comments in relation to the council's document F27B, that council's update. This is if Mr. Wasserberg is back on. Yes, excellent. Mr. Wasserberg, would you like to provide the comments that you want to make on that now, please? Mr. Wasserberg?
Yes, hi.
Sorry, did you hear? Were you
No, sorry, I had it on mute.
Apologies then. I just said that I've been informed during the break by Ms. Feeney that you forgot to mention some comment or make some comments on F27B. So before we move on to deliverability, would you like to make your comments in relation to that first, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I have some queries about F27B, and it's quite critical because it feeds into the 9.3 hectares that the council has as the basis for anticipated floor space loss that needs to be replaced. So I appreciate the provision of F27B because it provides more transparency. And these were issues that we had raised in both Matter 5 and Matter 10 hearing statements. So that is appreciated. I'd like to go to page 8 of that document.
Okay. Okay.
And now this has to do with the manner in which the council has converted employment floor space loss into the need for land. Now the council has applied a plot ratio that is a bit unclear to me, and it would be useful if they could explain it. But for example, and I'll point out 2 examples which are of concern. The first is in the 3 tables on the right-hand side, there's the middle one, which shows a loss of B1A of 70,844 square meters. Now, if a plot ratio of 0.4 is applied to it, it would be 17.7 hectares. The council has applied a plot coverage ratio of 0.7, which I assume is sort of some kind of middle ground between the 0.4 for an out-of-town office and 2, which would be for an urban or town center office. I'm not really sure why they've applied 0.7, but the council hasn't allocated any land for town center offices that I'm aware of. And so I don't see why they've used this sort of weighted average in order, and so they arrive at a figure of 10.63 hectares, which I feel is an underestimate of the amount of land that's required to reprovide this.
So you consider it should be a higher figure if you use the 0.4 ratio?
Yes, precisely. Now, in the table below that, the council strips out 2 sites to avoid what they call double counting. So they've stripped out the Ford Motor Company headquarters site and East Horndon Hall. So in this instance, they have an anticipated office floor space loss of 38,846. So again, the same issue arises. They've applied a different site coverage ratio in this instance of 0.66. So again, if you applied a 0.4, this would generate a need of 9.7 hectares. So in this table in the lower right-hand corner, it's quite important because you can see at the bottom there's that 9.2, really 9.3 figure that council has used. So that's the first point. One other point I'd like to make. When the council strips out the Ford Motor Company offices from its analysis to arrive at this 9.3 figure, the loss of the offices at Ford is 43,664 square meters, nearly 500,000 square feet of lost offices. It's a tremendous amount of employment that's being lost. What the council has done, it's stripped that out and converted that loss into the loss of the site, which is 3.25 hectares. And it includes it in its other category, which is for the reallocation of employment land. That's that 21 hectare figure, also headline figure that they use to arrive. So what they've done is they've taken 500,000 square feet of floor space lost, converted into a little more than 3 hectares, and have assumed that they can reprovide 500,000 square feet of lost offices on 3 hectares of land, which is, there are no sites that have been allocated for this sort of typology. And it is virtually impossible to reprovide that loss of 500,000 square feet. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I have a council response, please? Ms. Huang, please.
Yes, ma'am. I'm happy to assist Mr. Wassenberg's concerns relating to the plot ratios. I think I have set out very clearly on F27B, I think on page 3, but I would go through it again so that we understand where it comes from. With regards to the plot ratio of B1A, we assume that half of the future development would come forward in more denser settings in urban areas, or it can come forward in a more land efficient manner. Therefore, we assume half of the B1A would be will have the 200% plot ratio coverage, and then the other half we would apply the 40% coverage. I hope that makes sense. And in F27B, the examples that I give, Mr. Wassenberg, let me go to that table for you. Page 2 and 3, Mr. Wassenberg, that explains how the plot ratio is calculated. We didn't use the average ratio. We use that assumption. Now, you ask that most of the sites, employment sites, comes forward in the green belt or in a very, where, I don't know, industrial land uses, which is more land hungry. Okay, so we should look at the process of identifying needs and identifying the size. Those two processes are parallel, but the identifying needs process should not be contaminated by the supply, if that makes sense to you. We cannot come up with because we may risk predetermination. So we cannot start the position thinking that all the land provision in the future will be industrial land or logistics. We have to have that unbiased views in mind when identifying need. Therefore, the assumption that we use in terms of plot ratios is the standard and widely used in other local authorities. If you disagree with that, then I would say that is a matter of different opinions, and it's not has anything to do with the soundness of our approach. That's the first point. The second point, were you referring to the loss of employment sites, employment floor space on Fort Headquarters, site R04 and R13? I think I have explained that these two sites has already been covered in figure 7.5, where we say the forecast loss of these sites is 21.01 hectares. Now, again, if we apply the same approach to other sites going from employment floor space and convert it to the employment lands, yes, we could do that. That's one approach. But when we draft the plan, we anticipated that we would provide the land need for these sites as it was, and then that would allow for employment to come forward in a more efficient manner as well. So in summary, that has been covered in the 21.01 hectares that we will provide it, and that will be covered in the future employment land provision. Therefore, I don't see, I'm not sure whether we need to go over this again. It has been considered, is my point.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. What I'd like now to do is to move on to look at deliverability, please. And the updated employment trajectory that is provided in the Council's hearing statement, which is G10A. Now, I understand that obviously an element of this was discussed when we considered the site allocations in terms of bringing those forward, but I just want to go through the realism of the expectations for the trajectory in terms of the deliverability of the sites. Now, I note that 3 sites are in the first 5-year period of the plan period, so 2016 to 2021. So up to now, 3 sites should be being delivered or have been delivered. So again, so if we can start with those 3 sites, which is E08, E10 and E13. Obviously, E13 has outline planning permission. I'm aware of that. Can the council just explain, or any representatives that are in the room in relation to those sites, the realism of that delivery? Does the council wants to start?
Thank you, Inspector. So yes, the figures obviously set out there are indicative at this point. Obviously, we provide them in a range. I think in respect of EO8, I think we can accept that would probably need to be in the column in the 2021-26 period, bearing in mind obviously that is reliant upon being released from the Greenbelt. So I think we could accept that could be amended. In respect of the others, obviously the site of land at East Horden Hall, as we mentioned, that has got outline approval and being brought forwards. And with regards to land at Cotton Hall Farm, I think that possibly would fall into the same category as EO8, where obviously that's reliant upon release from the Greenbelt. I think it's more just trying to reflect, obviously, the current position as we are, that may need to be pushed into the other column.
I mean, I recognise that the employment trajectory doesn't form part of the plan or anything like that. It's not the same as a housing trajectory, but it's just about understanding in terms of the council strategy and about these sites coming forward. So the realism of the majority of the sites then would be coming forward in the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. So again, just the realism of that in relation to the range of sites that are set out there. You consider that's appropriate?
Yes, so I think obviously in terms of recognising that there is a range associated with that, not year by year, but I think at the same time we are talking about, I suppose particularly if we're talking about Brentwood Enterprise Park, we're expecting that to come forward obviously over a longer period of time, so that obviously does cover to from 2021-26 and then also 2026-2031. I think for the other sites of their scale and nature, they would be expected to be able to be brought forward at an earlier stage, accepting that some of those are obviously part of wider residential-led allocations, and obviously they can form parts of those proposals coming forwards. But there's obviously the smaller scale of those particular elements would lend themselves to being able to be delivered in a more agile way.
Okay, does anybody wish to comment on deliverability? Mr. Butcher, please.
Thank you. I mean, certainly as far as Childerditch Industrial Park is concerned, without wanting to go back over site specifics, but again, just refer you back to what we said in our statement of common ground, and you will see the background information to Childerditch Industrial Park. These two proposed new allocations there are adjacent to the existing industrial area. They're pretty well ready to go because they're serviced by roads and the necessary infrastructure to make those happen. So really on those sites, the issue is more about the fact that they're in the green belt, which would prevent their early development. So I think that the suggestion to come forward within the first 5 years, it would be entirely realistic.
Thank you. Can I bring in, I'm just going to go down the list. I'm sorry, I didn't see who put their hand up first. So I've got Mr. Taylor, Mr. Ireland, and then Mr. Clues. So Mr. Taylor first, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. I'm speaking to E10 and E11. In relation to E10, it's an existing employment site, and the issue is about taking a small part of land for that allocation out of the Greenbelt, but it is an existing employment site, so one has to bear that in mind. In terms of the Brentwood Enterprise Park, you've obviously heard all the material about that when we dealt with that specifically. The position of my clients is that the timescale shown on this timetable is entirely feasible. Indeed, it's conservative, given that my clients take the view that phase 2 of the Enterprise Park is likely to be completed by 2027. So there's considerable headroom, we would say, in this trajectory. I don't think I've got anything else to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Ireland, please.
Thank you. Our view is one of really a lack of flexibility and choice in the available supply within the borough. in a context where we're not dealing here with housing. There are different businesses that require plots of different sizes, that have different locational considerations, and that's an important consideration when we're looking at employment land. Now, what the trajectory shows currently is that in the period post 2026, you have just 2 sites that are delivering employment land provision for that 5-year period. And then you have no employment sites. Essentially, the council's expectation is that all employment sites will be built out by 2031, and so the back part of the plan period, there will be no employment land supply in the borough. And I think that serves to illustrate quite clearly a lack of flexibility in the position here. And then I think if I drill into the detail of that a little bit more, the provision at that in that latter part of the plan period, essentially beyond year 5 from where we are now, is focused at just 2 sites, which will appeal to components of an employment market, but won't address all of it. So, given the location of Brentwood Enterprise Park, I think we heard at the session dealing with E11 last week an essential expectation that will be focused on logistics activities. We then have the other site that's expected to deliver in that period is the Dunton Hills Garden Village, where there's essentially an office-based component to the provision there, and then elements of that site are really, in terms of what's expected, are somewhat undefined. An employment hub, which we expect to be office focused, and there's some delivery in village and neighbourhood centres, which isn't specified, but is probably more likely to be focused on what was B1 based activities. But what we don't find for very much of the plan period is much provision for say smaller industrial uses, in terms of the nature of supply that's being provided beyond essentially beyond year 5 and where we are now from 2026 onwards. And our view is that that's not consistent with the framework's emphasis on providing a significant weight on the need to support economic growth, because it's not providing a choice of sites or flexibility in the land supply position.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ireland. Can I bring in Mr. Clues, and then I will go to the council for a response.
Thank you, Mark. My point was actually very, very simple, just to address your question directly. For our clients' point of view, the employment part of our 03 is perfectly deliverable. The flexibility that we've been seeking in the policy results from discussion with potential occupiers, and we've got no concern about the trajectory set out by the council there, other than the overly precise nature of the land area, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Butcher, you've still got your hand up. Is that a new comment that you wish to make? Thank you. That answers that question. Now, obviously, for those sites that are linked with housing allocations, we will be going through the housing trajectory in a lot more detail as part of Matter 8. So that's not until March. So depending on those discussions, we may then also need to have a discussion in relation to bringing mixed development sites forward and employment on those. But I don't want to prejudge any consideration that's taken on board on there, but just to highlight that there may have to be highlighted again, but that would be purely for those where there's mixed development proposed on the sites. Does anybody else want to say anything on deliverability at this stage? Because I haven't got any further questions on that. No, nobody's put their hand up. Okay, so can we move on to the other employment policies that are set out in the plan? Now, I recognise that, and looking at PC04, now the council has suggested that this is deleted, as it's felt that this covers all the criteria that are set out there, or the elements that are set out. Some of them do seem to be sort of statements rather than actual requirements. Does anybody have any comments that they wish to make about the council's proposal to delete that policy? I think it makes sense to delete that policy. Mr. Minot. Mr. Minot? Sorry, you were on mute, I think, but you're okay now. So, Mr. Minot, please.
I'll come back from the background. I mean, if that's your attitude, that it makes sense to delete that policy, then clearly I'm deferring to your expert knowledge. My question really would be, though, the council's arguing that it feels that what it previously said in PC04 is essentially said elsewhere. My query really would be, where else is it saying the crucial things? Because PC04, I mean, one of the significant elements of PC04 is obviously that it was attempting to talk in terms of the it was talking in terms of the encouragement of new office research development and research facilities effectively in easily accessible locations near train stations, designated centres, easy walking and cycling distance. So, amongst other things, that's, for instance, talking about town centres. There's the burden of the employment sites which are being newly proposed are clearly not in town centres. I don't have an issue with things like the Brentwood Business Park and the other large locations and the location of those sites. But I do have concerns, as I've already expressed, with the way in which some of the more central sites, some of the more town central sites, the council seems to have turned its back on them. I mean, Mr. Wasberg's already said he's not aware that the council's allocated any land for town centre offices. I was interested by the fact that Ms. Huang talked in terms of, in responding to Mr. Wasberg just now, the assumptions of development coming forward in denser urban settings. But we're in a situation where the council is not, in my view, currently demonstrating that it's actually supporting the existence of employment uses in denser urban settings. And so PC04 was, at least to some extent, doing that. I can understand that the text which is being proposed in G10A to be added to PC03, which I quoted some of earlier, could well be regarded as replacing PC04. But as I said earlier, my own perspective is that we're not actually seeing employment sites, new employment sites being proposed in town centres. We're seeing a policy which suggests that the council is going to do everything it can to stop the erosion of employment sites in the town centres. But at the same time, simultaneously, the council is actually deleting existing employment sites in the town centres. And when you put that next to the fact that it's now turning around and saying, oh, we don't think we need PC04, in my personal opinion, that raises some serious questions. So I very much want to know exactly where the things which are being regarded as replacing PC04 are, and where, therefore, that commitment, which in my view was very welcome, that was in PCO4, to encourage employment sites in easy location of transport links and designated centres, is because I'm not seeing that commitment in terms of the sites themselves, and I've got a big concern, as I've already said.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. If the council can respond to Mr. Minot's points, please.
Ma'am, the proposed changes to PCO3 provide the protection. PCO4 itself is not really a policy, to be frank. It's just a statement which seeks to encourage the location of R&D and new offices in so-called designated centres and areas close to train stations. We have locations as proposed. We have the existing employment sites, and of course we have town centres which are close to transport hubs. And inevitably, if employment proposals come forward in those hubs and around those centres, they will be supported, provided they meet the requirements of the other policies in the plan. So this policy is otiose. It doesn't do anything to further the interests of employment opportunities in the borough.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any comments on policy PCO4? Can I move on then to PCO5?
Mom, could I just...
Oh, sorry, Mr. Minot.
Yeah. Although these aren't subjects which are under the Matter 10 list, it did strike me when I was looking more widely that you get the same kind of phrasing in other places. I mean, for instance, you have in PCO8, Section C, the council talks in terms of retail, leisure, office and other main town centre uses which we continue to be directed to those centres in line with the sequential approach to retail development location set out in the National Planning Policy Framework. And you've also got, in terms of the heading of the Section 7 Prosperous Communities section of the local plan, strategic priority 4, the council talks in terms of facilitating and supporting stronger and more vibrant town and village centres. Again, this is the same theme. The council is talking a good fight in terms of supporting town and village centres and directing retail, office and leisure uses to those centres. But as I say, I keep on making the same point. I don't actually think, in terms of the site allocations themselves, we are seeing evidence of the fact that the council is doing what it claims to be doing in things like strategic priority 4 or in terms of things like PCO8. So, and I think obviously, although they're not specifically things that we're supposed to be discussing this morning, I think there's a wider picture here. There's an apparent consistency in terms of what the council is saying across various policies, irrespective of the fact that PCO4 is proposed to be deleted. But there is, at the same time, an inconsistency between what is being repeatedly said and what is actually being done in terms of the proposals within the plan, the site-specific proposals.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. Would the council like to respond to Mr. Minot's points there? Anything further you want to add?
No, ma'am, there's nothing further we need to add. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can we move on then to have a look at PCO5? So can the council again just summarise the purpose of this policy so that we're clear on what it's trying to achieve and what it is to apply to in relation to existing and or new sites, etc. So if you can just clarify that.
Ma'am, if I may assist, the purpose of the policy is inconsistent with the NPPF, especially paragraph 127C and 109, in terms of sustainable development principles, and in terms of taking into account the surrounding context and traffic impacts of development. And the intention is that the future employment development would be accessible by means of sustainable transport and response to the surrounding context that it is located within.
So my first question is, do you need that policy when you already have other policies in relation to transport and dealing with highway implications? I know we haven't come to those policies as yet. That will be later. Is there anything specific to employment development that needs to be set out in a separate policy? And is this consistent with the other policies in the other policies in the plan, or does it cause confusion?
I think you're right, ma'am. I think the clause B of this policy has been covered by policy BE16 particularly. So I think we are open for it to be removed if everyone agrees with me. And in terms of the other criteria in apologies, let me open up this.
Yeah, because what about the scale and nature appropriate to the locality? Yeah. That's to do with character, etc.
Yeah.
And then the landscaping and screening. So those elements.
Potentially, they may have been covered by other policies. So when we review the policies modifications altogether, we can consider whether they can be removed. The purpose of the policies is that so that in the employment development in the future, when it comes forward, it will take into account the locations of such development, whether it's accessible and whether it takes into account the context. But you're right, some elements of this clause A may have been covered by other policies, and we can consider that.
Okay, because it's also that consistency with the proposed site allocations as well.
Yeah.
Because there may be elements in here that are covered within the site allocation policies or not covered. So again, it's just ensuring that there is clarity and that the policy is effective. And part of it is why employment development, in terms of criteria, needs to have its own policy in this aspect, because this should apply to all development, shouldn't it? About the need for the character to be taken into account and its location and landscaping and highway matters, etc., etc. So
I think you're right, Mom. So what we'll need to do is just to make sure that everything is covered in the suite of policies. Once we're satisfied that is so, and there is nothing in this list here which needs to be inserted into another policy, which is unlikely, we can then delete this.
If you can look into that, as I said, if something is brought forward to me and where it's absolutely essential that this element of the policy remains, then we can have a look at that.
Okay, that's what we'll do. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Are there any comments in relation to PCO5? I know that this element of confusion was raised by a few participants. So I'll bring in Mr. Butcher and then Mr. Taylor, please.
Mom, just a quick comment. I mean, there is some relevance in having a policy that relates to development proposals that might come forward outside of the allocated areas and setting out a list of considerations. I just simply raise that as a question.
Well, I think that's why the council is going to go away and see whether it's all covered within other policies. And as I said, if it's absolutely necessary for soundness, then that policy can remain, or elements of it can remain. Mr. Taylor, please.
Thank you, Mum. I think the point from my client's perspective is to address this issue of overlap in terms of criteria, given the detailed nature of the policies that relate, for example, to E11, where if you have a look at that in F9A, page 152, you'll see there are detailed policies relating to landscape, highways, all sorts of considerations. which have the potential to conflict with more broader policies in the plan. And what we're looking for is clarity, so that there is just simply one set of criteria to apply to an allocated scheme. We accept that there obviously have to be criteria that apply to schemes that aren't allocated, which may come forward elsewhere. But it seems to us to be unsound planning to have potentially overlapping criteria. And you'll have seen for our Matter 10 submission that's the concern. So if this policy PCO5 is going to come out because its criteria are applied in other policies in the plan, that doesn't necessarily solve the issue. We want it to be made absolutely clear that it's just one set of criteria. Thank you.
I think.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Shadaravian.
I think, Marm, we had a discussion about this. I think it was yesterday. I'm losing track of time.
I have to admit, so am I, Mr. Shadaravian.
And
they're merging all together now.
Mr. Taylor's absolutely right, of course. And what we agreed to do was look at all of the allocations and strip out from those anything that was covered by a generic subject policy. So that subject policies, which dealt with things like highways, need for traffic assessments, etc., where they applied, you didn't need further reference to it in the site-specific allocation. So we strip it out of the site-specific allocation, but only keep in things which are specific to that allocation if they differ in any way from the generic policy. So that's what we're going to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Taylor, the council's going to have a look at that. Obviously, until we've seen it, we won't be able to sort of, provide comments on that or consider that. But would that allay some of your concerns?
To an extent. The issue, of course, comes when there are still specific criteria that do remain for site-specific reasons in the allocation policy itself. There needs to then be some indication of which takes precedence, which criteria takes precedence, the generic one or the site-specific one. And that's the only point I make there.
I know that's noted indeed, and so there will need to be cross-reference to the generic policy where there is some additional requirement in the site allocation.
Well, thank you. I think we're getting there. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Taylor, and thank you, Mr. Shadaravian. Anything further on PCO5? If I can move now, we're moving to the last policy that we're going to be considering this morning, which is PCO6, supporting the rural economy. Now, our questions on this were in relation to all rural areas are in the Greenbelt, so therefore Greenbelt policy takes sort of precedent on this. So taking on board the comments that our MIQs, the council now proposes to delete this policy, but add relevant sections to the Greenbelt policies where it's obviously consistent with national policy, etc. And obviously this would apply to any rural employment provision that would potentially come forward in the Greenbelt area. Does anybody have any particular comments on that approach, on the council's approach? No. Oh, Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. It's a couple of questions for the council on the whole subject of the rural economy, really. And the first one is the correlation between employment opportunities. Do they come first in allocating new housing, or is it vice versa? So in other words, clarity on the strategy, because the two surely should be linked together.
I don't understand your question, Mr. Ratcliffe.
Okay. So there seems to be a disconnect between where housing is being placed in the rural part of Brentwood, particularly the northern part of Brentwood, and the creation of new employment opportunities.
And your question is?
What's the strategy?
Would the council like to respond on that? I think they're having a bit of a conflab, Mr. Ratcliffe, at the moment.
No, that's okay. I mean, it's linked to questions I've asked in previous sessions as well, where housing seems to be getting plonked in greenbelt areas, but there is no additional job creation. And furthermore, given the council's vision and some of its statements about reducing the need for people to travel in cars, surely housing should go to the areas where employment can be created, or be more focused on that, where there could be, say, live-work units created. So the whole strategy needs to be linked together a little bit better.
Well, I suppose what you're raising are issues in relation to the strategy rather than in relation to the policy, PCO6.
Yeah, it's a bit hard for a layman like me to understand where it's best to pose these questions.
Are there any other comments that you wanted to make on this point? Because what I want to do is go to the council at the end and let the council respond on all the points that you make, Mr. Ratcliffe, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
One may feed into the other, and then I don't want the council having to having to go back over something it's already answered. So have you got any further comments on that you want to tell us?
No, I think the other questions that I've got would follow the same logic that you've just explained, so I'm more than happy with that. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Drain, then, please.
Thank you, Inspector. In which case, shall I save a response until you've gone through all of the questions in order to, I can jot down some of the things. I'm conscious that whilst you say, obviously we're dealing with the matters of policy here and not wider strategy, these points have been raised by Mr. Minot as well as Mr. Ratcliffe, so I can provide a brief response on it. I'm happy to do that now. Equally, I'm happy to wait until you're ready for us to come back on the broader points.
Mr. Ratcliffe, I'm trying to understand, you've got a list of questions, so if you can, or a list of comments that you wish to make, if you want to just list those out now in its totality, or do you need a response from the council on your first question first to then, because it affects how you ask your next questions? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, precisely. The first question, if you like, was the place setter, which links in with previous questions I've asked about the strategy for the north.
Mr. Drain, can you just, I mean, obviously, we're not here to discuss the spatial strategy. I must highlight that. So, Council, is there anything you do wish to say on that point that's been raised?
Yeah, indeed. I think we've covered the issues within the strategy sessions. I appreciate the points that are being made here in regard to clearly the employment land provision and the way in which we've shaped policies will have some degree of linkage and should have a degree of linkage with the overall strategy for growth. Of course, the plan should be read as a whole and within context of understanding the broader aspirations and broader policies that are set out within it. So that's clear on our part. And I think, keep hearing this word used in terms of inconsistency between that employment strategy and the way in which the employment policies here relate to the way in which housing is being provided, for instance. I would just say that the council's position is that we're not being inconsistent. I think we're trying to meet a range of needs, as we're discussing across a range of sessions over these weeks. And of course, it is also related to the way in which land comes forward and is being promoted by particular promoters, developers, whatever the case may be. So specific to the issue being raised here in relation to whether it's appropriate to put housing land in the north of the borough compared to employment land, it is also related to that land that is available according to what is being promoted. So of course, that then comes back to the broader strategy and the broader process of how we've assessed sites to be suitable, deliverable, and the rest of the issues that we should be looking at. And a broader point in terms of these claims of inconsistency, because the allocations in themselves are supposedly not sufficient in terms of the comments that have been made within central areas. I think we would just say that, again, the plan's got to be read as a whole, and indeed there are policies in the plan to encourage employment growth where not every piece of land can be necessarily allocated for that type of growth. So I think points have been made earlier by colleagues on the extent to which job creation can come through a range of things outside of pure employment land. So we're talking in terms of a broader economic strategy for growth in those areas for job creation. Employment is one part of that. So I do take the points that have been made in terms of the consistency of the policies and the strategy. I would disagree that we are being inconsistent.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. Mr. Ratcliffe, could you give me your list your other comments then, please?
Okay, that response really only covers part of the answer to me, because when you read through the policy documents, and in particular the statements coming forward in answer to your original questions, you can clearly see that there's strategic approach to linking housing and jobs in, say, Dunton Hills Garden Village. You can actually see the correlation. You can see strategic themes coming through. But I still come back to the point that I've made in earlier sessions, that there's no joined up strategy for the north of the borough. So I just want to make that statement again, because it's clear to me that this is a mix of developer-led residential opportunities. So, Mr. Drain raises the point about sites being promoted. Surely a strategic plan should look beyond those sites purely developer-led.
Mr. Ratcliffe, we have the plan that is before us.
Yeah.
This session, I'm now looking at PCO6 and supporting the rural economy. The council has proposed the deletion of that policy. We've been through the spatial aspects of the plan, and we've discussed the site allocations. So in relation to this specific session, I would just like to sort of, bring you back and focus you back on to the purpose of this session, which is about employment. And I've heard what you're saying in relation to, if you're putting housing in the north, why isn't there employment in the north? That's
or vice versa, yeah.
Or vice versa, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing what you're saying, but we obviously we've heard that as part of the spatial strategy. And we've heard of all of that information, and we obviously have your submissions on that, and we will be going away and obviously considering all that. Are there any specific comments that you wish to make about PCO6 and the council's approach to not having that policy in the plan?
Yes, I mean, this might be me getting confused, but response to question.
Mr. Ratcliffe, it's just I'm trying to understand your points that you wish to make.
Okay, no, I understand. So looking at response to question 136, it says on the second page, so I'm looking at page 21 in the document, add the following paragraphs to follow 8.113. One of the council's objectives is to support economic growth in the rural area by encouraging the diversification and expansion of agriculture and other businesses and enterprise in the rural area. Now, for that statement to be brought to life, it needs to be linked to a strategy, particularly for the north, where we are almost 100% agricultural greenbelt. So again, if there was a village-wide strategy for the north, there could be areas of land that could be devoted to commerce, generally live-work units as part of a wider scheme. Proposals may be required to safeguard the employment function of the development from other uses through planning conditions mechanisms. So there's words around existing sites, but if you're creating new housing, the logic for me as a layman again would be that you would create business commerce type opportunities as well, even if it is as easy, if you like, as live work units, particularly in a post-COVID environment where people will be working more from home or looking to run businesses from home, commercial uses of properties.
Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe. Is that all the comments that you wish to make?
Yeah, I think it is. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Council, can I have just a response on the final points to Mr. Ratcliffe there? And then I'm proposing to draw this to a close.
Thank you, Inspector.
Mr. Jones?
I'm just trying to understand. I mean, I think if you're working with a blank piece of paper, in terms of then looking at the extent to which you can link employment opportunities and new opportunities for growth more broadly in terms of residential opportunities, if we're thinking about the north of the borough, clearly, there would be more opportunity to then do the types of things that we're talking about. I think we're limited by land supply and locations. You can't necessarily compare, for instance, the north of Brentwood, the Blackmore area, for instance, with Dunton Hills Garden Village, because we're talking about the provision of a garden village that therefore brings forward employment opportunities as part of that wider development for significant development in comparison to the level of development that's being proposed in the north of the borough. So my response would be that it's not possible to compare it in that way, and generally the aspiration of what we're looking to do here, I think, as others have set out, is to try and ensure that employment opportunities are coming forward in sustainable central locations and to link more rural locations to those opportunities as best we can.
Thank you. What I want to do now is obviously thank everybody for your participation today. It certainly gives us some food for thought. I know that the council is going to go away and have a look at some elements of policies again. So I'd like to thank the council for putting that forward as a suggestion. And it's something that we will look at. So on that note, unless there is anything further that anybody wants to add on this Matter 10 session on employment land provision, I'd like to thank you all and close the session. So thank you very much. We will be back on at 2 o'clock, which is looking at retail provision. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.